Eunice, having stationed his army out of range of their missiles, taunted the Romans by declaring that it was they, and not his men, who were runaways from battle. For the inhabitants of the city, at a safe distance, he staged a production of mimes in which the slaves acted out scenes of revolt from their individual masters, heaping abuse on their arrogance and the inordinate insolence that had led to their destruction. As for unusual strokes of ill fortune, even though some persons may be convinced that Providence has no concern with anything of the sort, yet surely it is to the interest of society that the fear of the gods should be deeply embedded in the hearts of the people. For those who act honestly because they are themselves virtuous are but few, and the great mass of humanity abstain from evil-doing only because of the penalties of the law and the retribution that comes from the gods. When these many great troubles fell upon the Sicilians, the common people were not only unsympathetic, but actually gloated over their plight, being envious because of the inequality in their respective lots and the disparity in their modes of life. Their envy, from being a gnawing canker, now turned to joy as it beheld the once resplendent lot of the rich changed and fallen into a condition such as was formerly beneath their very notice. Worst of all, though the rebels, making prudent provision for the future, did not set fire to the country estates, nor damage the stock or the stored harvests, and abstained from harming anyone whose pursuit was agriculture, the populace, making the runaway slaves a pretext, made sallies into the country, and with the malice of envy not only plundered the estates, but set fire to the buildings as well. 3. In Asia, King Attalus, soon after his accession to the throne, adopted an attitude markedly different from that of his predecessors. For they, by practicing kindness and benevolence, had prospered in their kingship. He, however, being cruel and bloodthirsty, visited on many of those subject to his rule irremediable disaster or death. Suspecting the most powerful of his father's friends of having formed designs against him, he decided that all must be put out of the way. Accordingly, he selected the most savagely murderous of his barbarian mercenaries, men who were also insatiate in their thirst for gold, and concealing them in certain chambers of the palace, sent in turn for the friends who were under suspicion. When they appeared, he had them all killed, for his underlings were as bloodthirsty as himself, and he gave immediate orders to inflict the same harsh treatment on their wives and children also. Of the other friends, those who had been appointed to commands in the army or as governors of cities, he had some assassinated, while others he arrested and put to death with their entire household. Because of his cruelty, he was hated not only by everyone subject to him, but by the neighboring peoples as well. Thus, he stirred all his subjects to hope for a revolution. Most of the captive barbarians, while they were being marched away, committed suicide or killed one another, being unwilling to tolerate the indignity of servitude. One, a mere lad, went up to his 3 sisters as they lay sleeping from exhaustion and cut their throats. Thwarted in his attempt to do away with himself as well, he was asked by his captors why he had killed his sister. He replied that there was nothing worth living for left to them. He himself, by refusing to eat, ended his life by starvation. These same captives, on reaching the boundaries of their land, threw themselves to the ground, and with cries of lamentation kissed the earth and even collected some of the dust in the folds of their garments, whereat all the army was moved to pity and sympathy. Each man, touched by the emotions common to humankind, was overcome with a sense of divine awe as he perceived that even barbarians, brute-like in spirit though they were, when fortune broke the customary bond between them and their native land, did not forget their fond affection for the sod that had reared them. 5. Tiberius Gracchus too was a son of that Tiberius who'd been twice consul, had conducted brilliant and important military affairs, and had had an honorable political career. Through his mother, he was also a grandson of Publius Scipio, the conqueror of Hannibal and the Carthaginians. But quite apart from his position as the scion of a distinguished family on both sides, even in his own right, he towered above the men of his generation in sagacity, in skill as a speaker, and in short, in every acquirement, and he was competent to hold his own in debate despite the greater prestige of his opponents. 6. The crowds poured into Rome from the country like rivers into the all-receptive sea, buoyed up with the hope of effecting their own salvation, since the law was their leader and ally, and their champion a man subject neither to favour nor to fear, a man, moreover, who for the sake of restoring the land to the people was determined to endure any toil or danger to his last breath. A.G. While his was not a group just recently assembled and drawn from many tribes, but comprised the most politically alert and the well-to-do segments of the populace. Since then, the strength on both sides was evenly balanced, and the scales tipped now this way, now that, the two parties, being assembled many thousand strong, clashed violently, and in the public assemblies there appeared billowing forms and patterns like waves of the sea. 7. Octavius, after being deposed, though refusing to acknowledge that he was a private citizen, yet did not dare to exercise as a magistrate the tribunician powers, but stayed quietly at home. Yet before ever he reached this state, he too had the opportunity, when Gracchus first proposed the plebiscite on his removal from office, to agree to a simultaneous motion, that would have embraced the removal of Gracchus from the tribunate. In that case, either they would both have become private citizens if the proposals were legal, or both would have continued in office if the proposals were adjudged unconstitutional. Since he was heading straight for destruction, he speedily met with the punishment he merited. Scipio, seizing a club that lay ready at hand, for his anger prevailed over any seeming difficulties, the news of the death of Gracchus reached the camp, and Africanus is said to have cried out, "So perish any other besides, who does such deeds." 8. The runaway Syrian, slaves, cut off the hands of their captives, but not content with amputation at the wrist included arms, and all in the mutilation. 9. Those who ate of the sacred fish found no relief from their pains, for the divine power, as if with the intention of holding up an example to deter the others, left all those who had acted so madly to suffer unsuccored. And since in keeping with the retribution visited on them by the gods, they have also received abuse in the pages of History, they have indeed reaped a just reward. 10. The Senate, prompted by religious scruples, sent a delegation to Sicily in accordance with an oracle of the Sibylline books. They visited throughout Sicily the altars set up to Athene and Zeus. Here they offered sacrifice and fenced in the areas and forbade access to them except in the case of those in each state who had traditional sacrifices to perform. 11. There was a certain Gorgas of Morgantina, surnamed Cambalus, a man of wealth and good standing, who, having gone out hunting, happened upon a robber nest of fugitive slaves and tried to escape on foot to the city. His father, Gorgas, chancing to meet him on horseback, jumped down and offered him the horse that he might mount and ride off to the city. But the son did not choose to save himself at his father's expense, nor was the father willing to make good his escape from danger by letting his son die. While they were still pleading with one another, both in tears, and were engaged in a contest of piety and affection, as paternal devotion vied with a son's love for his father, the bandits appeared on the scene and killed them both. 12. Zibalmius, the son of Diogilus, emulating his father's thirst for blood and nursing his anger at what the Thracians had done to Diogilus, went to such lengths of cruelty and lawlessness that he exacted punishment from those who offended him together with all their household. On the most trivial provocation, he tore men limb from limb, or crucified them, or burned them alive. He slaughtered children before the eyes of their parents or in a parent's arms, and carving up their bodies, would serve them to the closest of kin, reviving the storied banquets of Tereus and Ieste. Finally, the Thracians laid hands on Zeselmius, and though it was virtually impossible to retaliate upon him for his individual offences, for how could a single body make satisfaction for violence perpetrated against a whole nation? Nevertheless, within the range of what was possible, they exerted themselves to visit every indignity and punishment upon his person. 13. When the first king Attalus consulted the oracle on some matter, the Pythia is said to have volunteered this response. Be of stout heart, thou of the bull horns, thou shalt bear kingly honour, thou and thy children's children, but the children of these no longer. 14. Ptolemy, nicknamed Physcon, having discovered Cleopatra's estrangement from him, and being unable to wound her in any other way, had the audacity to commit a most wicked deed. Copying the murderous savagery of Medea, he put to death, in Cyprus, his own son and hers, a mere boy who was known as Memphites. Not content with this act of impiety, he committed another, far more heinous, abomination. After mutilating the body of the boy and placing it in a chest, He ordered one of his servants to convey it to Alexandria, for, since the birthday of Cleopatra was approaching, he had made arrangements to set the chest down in front of the palace on the eve of the occasion. This was done, and when the circumstance became known, Cleopatra put on mourning, and the populace went completely wild with rage against Ptolemy. 15. When spring with its warmth was melting the snow, and crops were now, after the long period of frost, beginning to develop and grow, and men too were resuming their activity, Asaces, wishing to feel out his enemies, sent envoys to discuss terms of peace. In reply, Antiochus told them that he would agree to the peace if Arsaces would release his brother Demetrius from captivity and send him home, if he would withdraw from the satrapies that he had seized by force, and if, retaining only his ancestral domain, he would pay tribute. Arsaces, taking offense at the harshness of the reply, placed an army in the field against him. 16. His friends pleaded with Antiochus not to join battle with the far more numerous Parthian hordes, since they, by taking refuge in the mountainous country that overlooked them, with its rough terrain, could neutralize the threat of his cavalry. Antiochus, however, completely disregarded their advice, remarking that it was disgraceful for the victorious to fear any ventures of those whom they had previously defeated. So, exhorting his men to the fray, he awaited with stout heart the onslaught of the barbarians. 17. When Antioch received the news of Antiochus's death, not only did the city go into public mourning, but every private house as well was dejected and filled with lamentation. Above all, the wailing of the women inflamed their grief. Indeed, since 300,000 men had been lost, including those who had accompanied the army as supernumeraries, not a household could be found that was exempt from misfortune. Some were mourning the loss of brothers, some of husbands, and some of sons, while many girls and boys, left orphaned, wept for their own bereavement, till at last time the best healer of grief dulled the edge of their sorrow. Athenaeus, the general of Antiochus, who in billeting his soldiers had done many wrongs, was the first to take flight. But though he abandoned Antiochus, he met the end he deserved, for when in his flight he reached certain villages that he had mistreated in connection with quartering his men, no one would admit him to his home or share food with him, and he roamed the countryside until he perished of starvation. 18. Arsaces, king of the Parthians, having crushed Antiochus, was minded to advance upon Syria, thinking that it would fall an easy prey. He did not, however, find it in his power to make the campaign. Far from it, for because of the magnitude of his successes, fortune set in his way perils and misfortunes many times as great. It is, I think, true that no unmixed blessing is granted to man by God, as if on purpose the divine power sees that fortune and misfortune in misfortune, good and evil, succeed one another. Of a certainty fortune did not on this occasion forget her proper nature, but as if fatigued by the bestowal of continuous favour on the same men, she contrived so great a turn of the tide in the whole conflict that the hitherto successful side was now completely humble. 19. Arsaces, king of the Parthians, was angry with the people of Seleucia and bore them a grudge for the despites and punishments that they had inflicted on his general, Ennius, when they sent a mission to him, pleading to win pardon for what had taken place, and pressed him for an answer. He led the envoys to the place where blind Pittides sat on the ground, his eyes gouged out, and bade them report to the men of Seleucia that they must all suffer the same fate. Thoroughly alarmed, they forgot their former troubles in view of the enormity of the horrors now anticipated, for men's new troubles regularly tend to cast prior misfortunes into the shade. 20. Hegelicus, sent by the elder Ptolemy I in 1265 C, command of an army against Marsyas, the general of the Alexandrians, captured him alive and wiped out his army. When Marsyas was brought before the king, and everyone anticipated that he would receive the most severe punishment, Ptolemy let the charges against him drop, for he was now beginning to suffer a change of heart, and by acts of kindness sought to remedy the hatred that the populace bore him. 21. Euhemerus, the king of the Parthians, was an Hyrcanian by race, and surpassed in cruelty all tyrants of whom we have record, so that there is no manner of punishment whatsoever that he did not employ. On the most casual pretexts he enslaved many of the Babylonians, together with all their families, and sent them to Media with orders that they should be sold as booty. He set fire to the agora of Babylon and to some of the temples, and destroyed the best part of the city. 22. when Antipater, Clonius, and Eropus, leaders of note, revolted and seized Laodicea, Alexander, nicknamed Sabinus, successfully attacked the city, but behaving with magnanimity, he gave them a free pardon, for he was kindly and of a forgiving nature, and moreover was gentle in speech and in manners, wherefore he was deeply beloved by the common people. 23. When Sextius, after capturing the city of the 124 Gauls, was selling its inhabitants as booty, a certain Crato, who had been a partisan of the Roman cause, and for that reason had endured many outrages and tortures at the hands of the rebels, his fellow citizen, was being conducted in chains together with the rest of the captives. When he espied the consul at his duties, and disclosed who he was, and that, as a supporter of Roman policy, he had gone through many and oft-repeated perils at the hands of his fellow citizens, not only was he, together with all his kindred, released and their property restored, but because of his loyalty to Rome, he was granted permission to exempt 900 of his fellows from slavery. Indeed, the consul treated him more generously even than he had anticipated, since he wished to give the Gauls a clear demonstration of Roman thoroughness, whether in dispensing mercy or in exacting reprisals. 24. The populace thronged about him not only when he took office, but also when he was a candidate, and even before, and on his return home from Sardinia they met him, and, as he disembarked, greeted him with acclamations and applause. Such was his extreme popularity with the common people. 25. Gracchus, having delivered public harangues on the subject of abolishing aristocratic rule and establishing democracy, and having won credit with all classes, had in these men no longer mere supporters, but rather sponsors of his own daring plans. Each man, in fact, bribed by hope of private gains, was ready to face any risk on behalf of the proposed laws, quite as though they were a personal interest. By taking away from the senators the right to serve in the courts and designating the knights as jurors, he made the inferior element in the state supreme over their betters. By disrupting the existing harmony of senate and knights, he rendered the common people hostile towards both. Then, by using this general dissension as a stepping stone to personal power, and by exhausting the public treasury on base and unsuitable expenditures and favours, he made everyone look only to him as leader. By sacrificing the provinces to the reckless rapacity of the tax farmers, he provoked the subject peoples to well-merited hatred of their rulers, and by relaxing through legislation the severity of the old discipline as a means of currying favour with the soldiers, he introduced disobedience and anarchy into the state. For a man who despises those in authority over him rebels also against the laws, and from these practices come fatal lawlessness and the overthrow of the state. Gracchus reached such heights of power and arrogance that when the plebs voted to exile Octavius from the city, he set him free, stating to the people that he did this as a favour to his own mother, who had interceded for the man. 26. Publius was escorted by weeping throngs as he departed from the city into exile. Indeed, the populace was not unaware that his banishment was unjust, but corrupted by bribery directed against him. It had deprived itself of the freedom to denounce evil. 27. 17 tribes voted against the law, and an equal number of others approved it. When the 18th was tallied, there was a plurality of 1 for those supporting the measure. While the decision of the people was narrowing down to so close a finish, Gracchus was as overwrought as if he were fighting for very life, but when he realized that he had won by the addition of a single vote, he cried out, "Now the sword hangs over the head of my enemies. As for all else, whatever the decision of fortune, we shall be content." Alexander, having no confidence in the masses because of their inexperience of the hazards of war and their readiness for any change, did not venture to join battle, but resolved to get together the royal treasures and steal the offerings dedicated to the gods, and with these to sail away by night to Greece. He made an attempt to plunder the temple of Zeus, employing for the purpose certain barbarians, but was detected, and together with his troops all but met with condign punishment on the spot. Having managed, however, to slip away with a few men, he attempted to make his escape to Seleucia. The news, however, outran him, and when the Seleucians heard about the temple robbery, they barred his entry into the city. Having failed in this attempt too, he rushed to seek refuge at Poseidium, clinging to the seacoast in his flight. Alexander, after his temple robbery, tried to escape to Poseidium. But all unseen, we may assume, a divine power was following at his heels in close pursuit, and, cooperating to effect his punishment, forced him closer and ever closer to his proper doom. He was, in fact, apprehended and taken before Antiochus at his camp only 2 days after the temple robbery. In such wise does avenging justice inescapably pursue the rash deeds of impious men. Aye, vigilant avengers track down the sinner, and the punishment that they bring is swift. But yesterday he had been a king and the leader of 40,000 men under arms. Now he was being led in chains to face insults and punishment at the hands of his foes. When Alexander, the king of Syria, was being led in chains through the camp, it appeared incredible not only to those who heard of it, but even to eyewitnesses, for the expectation that it could never happen strove to tip the balance against the plain evidence of the senses. But when the truth was confirmed by actual sight, one and all marveled as they turned from the scene, some applauding with frequent expressions of approval the manifestation of divine power, others commenting variously on the instability of fortune, the changeableness of human affairs, the sudden turns of the tide, and the mutability of human life, so far beyond all that a man would expect. 2080. Gracchus, whose partisans were numerous, continued to resist, but as he was constantly and increasingly being humiliated and had unexpected disappointments, he began to fall into a kind of frenzy and state of madness. Assembling the conspirators at his own house, he decided, after consultation with Flaccus, one, that they must overcome their opponents by force of arms and make an attack on the consuls and the Senate. Accordingly, he urged them all to wear swords beneath their togas, and as they accompanied him to pay close attention to his orders. Since Opimius I was at the Capitol debating what should be done, Gracchus and his malcontents started for that place, but finding the temple already occupied and a large number of nobles collected, he withdrew to the portico behind the temple, a prey to agony of spirit and fiendish torments. While he was still in this frenzied state, a certain Quintus, a man on terms of familiarity with him, fell at his knees and besought him to take no violent or irreparable steps against the fatherland. Gracchus, however, acting now openly as a tyrant, knocked him headlong to the ground and ordered his companions to dispatch him and to make this the beginning of reprisals against their opponents. The consul, aghast, announced to the Senate the murder and the coming attack upon themselves. 29. After the death of Gracchus, at the hands of his own slave, Lucius Vitellius, who had been one of his friends and was the first to come upon his body, not only did not grieve at what had befallen his dead friend, but having removed his head and carried it home, displayed a special ingenuity in exorbitant greed and a callousness that knew no bound. The consul had made proclamation that he would give for the head its weight in gold to the man who brought it in. Lucius, therefore, bored through the neck, and having removed the brain, poured in molten lead. He then produced the head and received the gold, but was despised for the rest of his life for this betrayal of friendship. Like Gracchus, the Flacci also were killed. 30. Flaccus, to reveal his identity for the sake of running about prescription or confiscation, expectation. This lawlessness, she, 30. The Cordici, having taken great quantities of booty, induced many others to adopt the same policy, and to consider the pillaging of others' property, and the harrying of others' property, and the harrying of mark of manly behaviour. For it is but a confirmation of the law of nature when the strong ravage the property of the weak. 30b. Later, the Scordici, by refusing passage, demonstrated that even Rome's superiority rested not on her own strength, but on the weakness of others. 30. Understanding, which is thought to be master of all things, is weaker than one thing only, fortune. Many a time her spitefulness unexpectedly ruins what a man has mapped out with intelligence and shrewdness. And again, at times, contrary to all expectations, she sets to right affairs which, in our folly, we have despaired of. As a result, one who finds her unfailingly propitious may succeed in almost all undertakings, while those to whom she is adverse fail in their individual actions, and some may be cynique. 31. In Libya, when the kings met in combat, Jugurtha was victorious in battle and slew many of the Numidians. His brother Adherbal took refuge in Cirta, where, being beleaguered in a close siege, he sent envoys to Rome, begging the Romans not to ignore the jeopardy of a friendly and allied king. The Senate dispatched legates to break the siege. When Jugurtha paid no heed, they sent a second legation, of greater weight. After they too had returned empty-handed, Jugurtha surrounded the city with a trench and through privation wore down its inhabitants. His brother came out holding a suppliant's bow, and though he abdicated the kingship and begged only for life, Jugurtha slew him, without regard either to kinship or to the rights of a suppliant. He likewise tortured and put to death all the Italians who had fought on his brother's side. 32. Jugurtha, the king of the Numidians, marvelling at the manly courage of the Romans and praising their exploits, declared to his friends that with these men he could traverse all Libya. She. 2:32. When the news broke upon them of the death of and of those who had perished with him, the city was filled with cries and lamentation. For many were the children left orphans, and not a few too. Brothers? 57:33. The consul Nasica was a man distinguished in his own right and was, as well, esteemed for his noble lineage. He belonged, in fact, to that gens whose scions had acquired the names Africanus, Asiaticus, and Hispanus, for since one of their number subdued Libya, another Asia, and the third Spain, each one for himself a cognomen signifying his achievements. But in addition to the high repute of his ancestors generally, he had for father and grandfather two of the most prominent men in Rome. Both held the position of leader of the Senate and of first speaker, each to the time of his death, and in addition, the grandfather was by decree of the Senate adjudged the best man in the state. For it was found written in the Sibylline oracles that the Romans should establish a temple for the great mother of the gods, that her sacred objects should be fetched from Pessinus in Asia, and be received in Rome by a muster of the whole populace going forth to meet them, that of the noblest men and women alike, the good woman, and that they should lead the welcoming procession when it took place and receive the sacred objects of the goddess. When the Senate proceeded to carry out the instructions of the oracle, Publius Nasica was selected as the best of all the men and Valeria as the best of the women. Not only was he considered outstanding in piety towards the gods, but he was a statesman as well, and a man who spoke his mind in public debate shrewdly. After the Hannibalic War, for example, Marcus Cato, dubbed Demosthenes, made it his practice to remark on every occasion, when stating his opinion in the Senate, that Carthage did not exist, and he kept repeating this even when no relevant motion was before the House and different matters were in turn being considered. Nasica, however, always expressed the contrary wish, may Carthage exist for all time. Now, though each point of view seemed to the Senate to merit consideration, that of Nasica was regarded by the more intelligent members as being far and away the better. Rome's strength should be judged, they thought, not by the weakness of others, but by showing herself greater than the great. Furthermore, so long as Carthage survived, the fear that she generated compelled the Romans to live together in harmony and to rule their subjects equitably and with credit to themselves. That's the best means to maintain and extend an empire. But once the rival city was destroyed, it was only too evident that there would be civil war at home, and that hatred for the governing power would spring up among all the allies because of the rapacity and lawlessness to which the Roman magistrates would subject them. All this did indeed happen to Rome after the destruction of Carthage, which brought in its wake the following: dangerous demagoguery, the redistribution of land, major revolts among the allies, prolonged and frightful civil wars, and all the other things predicted by Scipio. Now it was this man's son who, as an old man and leader of the Senate, killed with his own hands Tiberius Gracchus after the latter had attempted to gain absolute power. The masses were angry and raged against the perpetrators of the deed, while the tribunes even hailed the senators one by one to the rostra and demanded to know who the actual murderer was. All the rest, fearing the impetuosity and violence of the crowd, denied any knowledge or gave devious and conflicting answers. Scipio alone admitted that the killing was done by him, adding that, unbeknown to the rest of the city, Gracchus had been aiming at tyranny, and that only he and the Senate had not been deceived. The crowd, though disgruntled, subsided, awed by the dignity of the man and his frank statement. Now, this man's son, too, who died in the year in question, remained incorruptible throughout his entire career, and since he took part in public affairs and proved himself a true lover of wisdom, not in words alone, but in his way of life, his legacy of virtue was indeed in keeping with his noble lineage. 84. Shortly after Antiochus Cyzicenus gained the throne, he lapsed into drunken habits, crass self-indulgence, and pursuits utterly inappropriate to a king. He delighted, for example, in mimes and pantomimic actors, and generally in all showmen, and devoted himself eagerly to learning their crafts. He practiced also how to manipulate puppets, and personally to keep in motion silver-plated and gilded animals 5 cubits high, and many another such contrivance. On the other hand, he possessed no store of city-takers or other instruments of siegecraft that might have brought him high renown and performed some service worth recording. He was, moreover, addicted to hunting at odd and unseasonable hours, and many a time would slip away from his friends at night, and making his way to the country with 2 or 3 servants go in pursuit of lions, panthers, or wild boars. And since, in grappling with brute beasts, he was reckless, he frequently put his own life in extreme peril. 35. Micipsa, the son of the Numidian king Massinissa, had several other sons, but his favourites were Adherbal, the elder, Cis of his children, Iapsimus and Micipsa. Now Micipsa was the most civilized of all the Numidian kings, and lived much in the company of cultivated Greeks whom he had summoned to his court. He took a great interest in culture, especially philosophy, and waxed old both in the exercise of power and in the pursuit of wisdom. 35. There came to Rome a member of the royal family, another Jugurtha, who was a contender for the throne of Numidia. Since he was extremely popular, Jugurtha hired murderers to assassinate him, then returned without let or hindrance to his kingdom. 36. Contoniatus, chieftain of the Gaulish city called Iontora, was a man of unusual sagacity and military ability, and was a friend and ally of the Roman people. This was natural, as he had previously spent much time in Rome, had come to share their ideals and way of life, and through Rome's support had succeeded to his chieftainship in Gaul. 38. Though a member of the staff and a legate, received scant notice from the general, since he was least of the legates in repute, while the other legates, more prominent by virtue of the offices they had held and the nobility of their birth, received many marks of favour from the general. Marius, who was reputed to have been a tax farmer and had barely secured election to the lower ranks of office, was slighted whenever preferment was made to posts of honour, but whereas each of the others, avoiding all possible discomfort in the performance of their military duties, preferred a life of ease and indolence, Marius, when assigned, as he frequently was, to lead his men into the thick of battle, welcomed the disparagement shown therein, and applying himself eagerly to such services acquired much experience in warfare. And since he had a natural talent for combat and battle, and gladly exposed himself to their risks, he soon won great influence and a reputation for courage. Moreover, by treating his soldiers with consideration, and by employing means designed to please those under his command, whether in bestowing gifts, in conversation, or in routine contacts with them, he gained great popularity among his men. In return for his favours, they fought all the more zealously when in battle with him, in order to enhance his prestige. But if some other legate happened to be in command, they played the coward deliberately and at the most crucial moments. So it came about that, as a rule, the Romans suffered setbacks under the command of the others, but always conquered if Marius was present. 39. Bocchus, who had a kingdom in Libya, after hurling many reproaches at the men who had persuaded him to take up arms against the Romans, sent envoys to Marius. He besought pardon for his past offences and requested a pact of friendship, promising that he would be helpful to the Romans in many ways. When Marius told him to address his petitions to the Senate, the king dispatched an embassy to Rome charged with these matters. The Senate, however, returned them the answer that Bocchus would be granted complete satisfaction provided he won Marius's consent. Now Marius had in mind to capture King Jugurtha, and Bocchus met his wishes by sending for Jugurtha, ostensibly to discuss with him matters pertaining to their common advantage, and having seized and bound him, he then handed him over to Lucius Sulla, the quaestor appointed to escort him. Thus did Bocchus, securing his own safety at Jugurtha's expense, escape retribution at the hands of the Roman. While the elder Ptolemy was shut up in the city of Seleucia, a plot against him was formed by one of his friends. He arrested and punished the offender, and henceforth did not trust his safety to friends indiscriminately. 37. A.G. of Carbo and Silanus. Since so great a multitude had perished, some grieved for sons, others for brothers. Children, left fatherless, bewailed the loss of a sire and the desolation of Italy, and large numbers of women, bereft of their husbands, were made acquainted with the sad fate of widowhood. The Senate, with courageous fortitude in the face of disaster, sought to restrain the general mourning and the excessive lamentation, and bore their heavy load of grief without showing it. Fragments of Book XVIII. In Rome, at about the same time that Marius defeated the Libyan kings Bocchus and Jugurtha in a great battle, and slew many tens of thousands of Libyans, and, later, took thence and held captive Jugurtha himself, after he had been seized by Bocchus, who thereby won pardon from the Romans for the offences that had brought him into war with them. At the time, furthermore, that the Romans, at war with the Cimbri, were disheartened, having met with very serious reverses in Gaul. At about this time, I repeat, men arrived in Rome from Sicily, bearing news of an uprising of slaves, their numbers running into many tens of thousands. With the advent of this fresh news, the whole Roman state found itself in a crisis, inasmuch as nearly 60,000 allied troops had perished in the war in Gaul against the Cimbri, and there were no legionary forces available to send out. 2. Even before the new uprising of the slaves in Sicily, there had occurred in Italy a number of short-lived and minor revolts, as though the supernatural was indicating in advance the magnitude of the impending Sicilian rebellion. The first was at Nuceria, where 30 slaves formed a conspiracy and were promptly punished. The second at Capua, where 200 rose in insurrection and were promptly put down. The third was surprising in character. There was a certain Titus Minucius, a Roman knight and the son of a very wealthy father. This man fell in love with a servant girl of outstanding beauty who belonged to another. Having lain with her and fallen unbelievably in love, he purchased her freedom for 7 Attic talents, his infatuation being so compelling, and the girl's master having consented to the sale only reluctantly, and fixed a time by which he was to pay off the debt, for his father's abundant means obtained him credit. When the appointed day came and he was unable to pay, he set a new deadline of 30 days. When this day too was at hand and the sellers put in a claim for payment, while he, though his passion was in full tide, was no better able than before to carry out his bargain, he then embarked on an enterprise that passes all comprehension. He made designs on the life of those who were dunning him, and arrogated to himself autocratic powers. He bought up 500 suits of armour, and contracting for a delay in payment, which he was granted, he secretly conveyed them to a certain field and stirred up his own slaves, 400 in number, to rise in revolt. Then, having assumed the diadem and a purple cloak, together with lictors and the other appurtenances of office, and having with the cooperation of the slaves proclaimed himself king, he flogged and beheaded the persons who were demanding payment for the girl. Arming his slaves, he marched on the neighbouring farmsteads and gave arms to those who eagerly joined his revolt, but slew anyone who opposed him. Soon he had more than 700 soldiers, and having enrolled them by centuries, he constructed a palisade and welcomed all who revolted. When word of the uprising was reported at Rome, the Senate took prudent measures and remedied the situation. Of the praetors, then in the city, they appointed one, Lucius Lucullus, one to apprehend the fugitives. That very day, he selected 600 soldiers in Rome itself, and by the time he reached Capua, had mustered 4,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. Vettius, on learning that Lucullus was on his way, occupied a strong hill with an army that now totaled more than 3,500 men. The forces engaged, and at first the fugitives had the advantage, since they were fighting from higher ground. But later, Lucullus, by suborning Apollonius, the general of Vettius, and guaranteeing him in the name of the state immunity from punishment, persuaded him to turn traitor against his fellow rebels. Since he was now cooperating with the Romans and turning his forces against Vettius, the latter, fearing the punishment that would await him if he were captured, slew himself, and was presently joined in death by all who had taken part in the insurrection, save only the traitor Apollonius. Now these events, forming as it were a prelude, preceded the major revolt in Sicily, which began in the following manner. There were many new uprisings of slaves, The first at Nuceria, where 30 slaves formed a conspiracy and were promptly punished, and the second at Capua, where 200 slaves rose in insurrection and also were promptly punished. The third revolt was extraordinary and quite out of the usual pattern. There was a certain Titus Vettius, a Roman knight, whose father was a person of great wealth. Being a very young man, he was attracted by a servant girl of outstanding beauty who belonged to another. Having lain with her and even lived with her for a certain length of time, he fell marvelously in love and into a state bordering, in fact, on madness. Wishing, because of his affection for her, to purchase the girl's freedom, he at first encountered her master's opposition, but later, having won his consent by the magnitude of the offer, he purchased her for 7 Attic talents, and agreed to pay the purchase price at a stipulated time. His father's wealth obtaining him credit for the sum, he carried the girl off and, hiding away at one of his father's country estates, sated his private lust. But when the stipulated time for the debt came round, he was visited by men sent to demand payment. He put off the settlement till 30 days later, and when he was still unable to furnish the money, but was now a very slave to love, he embarked on an enterprise that passes all comprehension. Indeed, the extreme severity of his affliction and the embarrassment that accompanied his failure to pay promptly caused his mind to turn to childish and utterly foolish calculations. Faced by impending separation from his mistress, he formed a desperate plot against those who were demanding payment. 8. In the course of Marius's campaign against the Cimbri, the Senate granted Marius permission to summon military aid from the nations situated beyond the sea. Accordingly, Marius sent to Nicomedes, the king of Bithynia, requesting assistance. The king replied that the majority of the Bithynians had been seized by tax farmers and were now in slavery in the Roman provinces. The Senate then issued a decree that no citizen of an allied state should be held in slavery in a Roman province, and that the praetors should provide for their liberation. In compliance with the decree, Licinius Nerva, who was at this time governor of Sicily, appointed hearings and set free a number of slaves, with the result that in a few days more than 800 persons obtained their freedom, and all who were in slavery throughout the island were agog with hopes of freedom. The notables, however, assembled in haste and entreated the praetor to desist from this course. Whether he was won over by their bribes or weakly succumbed in his desire to favor them, in any case, he ceased to show interest in these tribunals, and when men approached him to obtain freedom, he rebuked them and ordered them to return to their masters. The slaves, banding together, departed from Syracuse and, taking refuge in the sanctuary of the Palicii, canvassed the question of revolution. From this point on, the audacity of the slaves was made manifest in many places, but the first to make a bid for freedom were the 30 slaves of 2 very wealthy brothers in the region of Haliciae, led by a man named Varius. They first murdered their own masters by night as they lay sleeping, then proceeded to the neighboring villas and summoned the slaves to freedom. In this one night, more than 120 gathered together. Seizing a position that was naturally strong, they strengthened it even further, having received in the meantime an increment of 80 armed slaves. Licinius Nerva, the governor of the province, marched against them in haste, but though he placed them under siege, his efforts were in vain. When he saw that their fortress could not be taken by force, he set his hopes on treason. As the instrument for his purpose, he had one Gaius Titinius, surnamed Gadeus, whom he won over with promises of immunity. This man had been condemned to death 2 years before, but had escaped punishment, and living as a brigand had murdered many of the free men of the region, while abstaining from harm to any of the slaves. Now, taking with him a sufficient body of loyal slaves, he approached the fortress of the rebels as though intending to join them in the war against the Romans. Welcomed with open arms as a friend, he was even chosen, because of his valor, to be general, whereupon he betrayed the fortress. Of the rebels, some were cut down in battle, and others, fearing the punishment that would follow on their capture, cast themselves down from the heights. Thus was the first uprising of the fugitives quelled. For, after the soldiers had disbanded and returned to their usual abodes, word was brought that 80 slaves had risen in rebellion and murdered Publius Clonius, who had been a Roman knight, and, further, that they were now engaged in gathering a large band. The praetor, distracted by the advice of others, and by the fact that most of his forces had been disbanded, failed to act promptly and so provided the rebels an opportunity to make their position more secure. But he set out with the soldiers that were available, and after crossing the river Alba, passed by the rebels who were quartered on Mount Caprianus and reached the city of Heraclea. By spreading the report that the praetor was a coward, since he had not attacked them, they aroused a large number of slaves to revolt, and with an influx of many recruits who were equipped for battle in such fashion as was possible. Within the first 7 days, they had more than 800 men under arms, and soon thereafter numbered not less than 2,000. When the praetor learned at Heraclea of their growing numbers, he appointed Marcus Titinius as commander, giving him a force of 600 men from the garrison at Enna. Titinius launched an attack on the rebels, but since they held the advantage, both in numbers and by reason of the difficult terrain, he and his men were routed, many of them being killed, while the rest threw down their arms and barely made good their escape by flight. The rebels, having gained both a victory and so many arms all at once, maintained their efforts all the more boldly, and all slaves everywhere were now keyed up to revolt. Since there were many who revolted each day, their numbers received a sudden and marvelous increase, and in a few days there were more than 6,000. Thereupon they held an assembly, and when the question was laid before them, first of all chose as their king a man named Salvius, who was reputed to be skilled in divination and was a flute player of frenetic music at performances for women. When he became king, he avoided the cities, regarding them as the source of sloth and self-indulgence, and dividing the rebels into 3 groups, over whom he set a like number of commanders. He ordered them to scour the country and then assemble in full force at a stated time and place. Having provided themselves by their raids with an abundance of horses and other beasts, they soon had more than 2,000 cavalry and no fewer than 20,000 infantry, and were by now making a good showing in military exercises. So, descending suddenly on the strong city of Morgantina, they subjected it to vigorous and constant assaults. The praetor, with about 10,000 Italian and Sicilian troops, set out to bring aid to the city, marching by night. Discovering on his arrival that the rebels were occupied with the siege, he attacked their camp, and finding that it was guarded by a mere handful of men, but was filled with captive women and other booty of all sorts, he captured the place with ease. After plundering the camp, he moved on Morgantina. The rebels made a sudden counterattack, and, since they held a commanding position and struck with might and main, at once gained the ascendant, and the praetor's forces were routed. When the king of the rebels made proclamation that no one who threw down his arms should be killed, the majority dropped them and ran. Having outwitted the enemy in this manner, Salvius recovered his camp, and by his resounding victory got possession of many arms. Not more than 600 of the Italians and Sicilians perished in the battle, thanks to the king's humane proclamation, but about 4,000 were taken prisoner. Having doubled his forces, since there were many who flocked to him as a result of his success, Salvius was now undisputed master of the open country and again attempted to take Morgantina by siege. By proclamation, he offered the slaves in the city their freedom, but when their masters countered with a like offer if they would join in the defense of the city, they chose rather the side of their masters, and by stout resistance repelled the siege. Later, however, the praetor, by rescinding their emancipation, caused the majority of them Io desert to the rebels. 5. In the territory of Segesta and Lilybaeum and of the other neighboring cities, the fever of insurrection was also raging among the masses of slaves. Here, the leader was a certain Athenian, a man of outstanding courage, a Cilician by birth. He was the bailiff of 2 very wealthy brothers, and having great skill in astrology, he won over first the slaves who were under him, some 200, and then those in the vicinity, so that in 5 days he had gathered together more than 1,000 men. When he was chosen as king and had put on the diadem, he adopted an attitude just the opposite to that of all the other rebels. He did not admit all who revolted, but making the best ones soldiers, he required the rest to remain at their former labors and to busy themselves each with his domestic affairs and his appointed task. Thus, Athenian was enabled to provide food in abundance for his soldiers. He pretended, moreover, that the gods forecasted for him, by the stars, that he would be king of all Sicily. Consequently, he must needs conserve the land and all its cattle and crops as being his own property. Finally, When he had assembled a force of more than 10,000 men, he ventured to lay siege to Lilybaeum, an impregnable city. Having failed to achieve anything, he departed thence, saying that this was by order of the gods, and that if they persisted in the siege, they would meet with misfortune. While he was yet making ready to withdraw from the city, ships arrived in the harbour, bringing a contingent of Mauritanian auxiliaries, who had been sent to reinforce the city of Lilybaeum, and had as their commander a man named Gomon. He and his men made an unexpected attack by night on Athenians' forces as they were on the march, and after felling many and wounding quite a few others, returned to the city. As a result, the rebels marvelled at his prediction of the event by reading the stars. 6. Turmoil and a very Iliad of woes possessed all Sicily. Not only slaves, but also impoverished freemen were guilty of every sort of rapine and lawlessness, and ruthlessly murdered anyone they met, slave or free, so that no one should report their frenzied conduct. As a result, all city dwellers considered what was within the city walls scarcely their own, and whatever was outside as lost to them and subject only to the lawless rule of foray. And many besides were the strange deeds perpetrated in Sicily, and many were the perpetrators. 11. Not only one did the multitude of slaves who had plunged into revolt ravage the country, but even those freemen who possessed no holdings on the land resorted to rapine and lawlessness. Those without means, impelled alike by poverty and lawlessness, streamed out into the country in swarms, drove off the herds of cattle, plundered the crops stored in the barns, and murdered without more ado all who fell in their way, slave or free alike, so that no one should be able to carry back news of their frantic and lawless conduct. Since no Roman officials were dispensing justice and anarchy prevailed, there was irresponsible license, and men everywhere were wreaking havoc far and wide. Hence, every region was filled with violence and rapine, which ran riot and enjoyed full license to pillage the property of the well-to-do. Men who aforetime had stood first in their cities in reputation and wealth, now through this unexpected turn of fortune were not only losing their property by violence at the hands of the fugitives, but were forced to put up with insolent treatment even from the freeborn. Consequently, they all considered whatever was within the gates scarcely their own, and whatever was without the walls as lost to them and subject only to the lawless rule of force. In general, there was turmoil in the cities, and a confounding of all justice under law, for the rebels, supreme in the open country, made the land impassable to travellers, since they were implacable in their hatred for their masters, and never got enough of their unexpected good fortune. Meanwhile, the slaves in the cities, who were contracting the infection and were poised for revolt, were a source of great fear to their masters. 7. After the siege of Morgantina, Salvius, having overrun the country as far as the plain of Leontini, assembled his whole army there, no fewer than 30,000 picked men, and after sacrificing to the heroes, the Palisi, dedicated to them in thank offering for his victory a robe bordered with a strip of seed purple. At the same time, he proclaimed himself king and was henceforth addressed by the rebels as Tryphon. As it was his intention to seize Triocala and build a palace there, he sent to Athenian, summoning him as a king might summon a general. Everyone supposed that Athenian would dispute the primacy with him, and that, in the resulting strife between the rebels, the war would easily be brought to an end. But fortune, as though intentionally increasing the power of the fugitives, caused their leaders to be of one mind. Tryphon came promptly to Triocala with his army, and thither also came Athenian with 3,000 men, obedient to Tryphon as a general is obedient to his king. The rest of his army he had sent out to cover the countryside and rouse the slaves to rebellion. Later on, suspecting that Athenian would attack him, given the opportunity, Tryphon placed him under detention. The fortress, which was already very strong, he equipped with lavish constructions and strengthened it even more. This place, Triocala, is said to be so named because it possesses 3 fine advantages. First, an abundance of flowing springs whose waters are exceptionally sweet. Second, an adjacent countryside yielding vines and olives and wonderfully amenable to cultivation. And third, surpassing strength, for it is a large and impregnable ridge of rock. This place, which he surrounded with a city wall 8 stades in length, and with a deep moat, he used as his royal capital, and saw that it was abundantly supplied with all the necessities of life. He constructed also a royal palace and a marketplace that could accommodate a large multitude. Moreover, he picked out a sufficient number of men endowed with superior intelligence, whom he appointed counselors and employed as his cabinet. When holding audience, he put on a toga bordered in purple and wore a wide-bordered tunic and had lictors with axes to precede him. And in general, he affected all the trappings that go to make up and embellish the dignity of a king. 8. To oppose the rebels, the Roman Senate assigned Lucius Licinius Lucullus, with an army of 14,000 Romans and Italians, 800 Bithynians, Thessalians, and Acarnanians, 600 Lucanians, commanded by Cleptius, a skilled general and a man renowned for valor, besides 600 others, for a total of 17,000. With these forces he occupied Sicily. Now Tryphon, having dropped the charges against Athenian, was making plans for the impending war with the Romans. His choice was to fight at Triacala, but it was Athenians' advice that they ought not to shut themselves up to undergo siege, but should fight in the open. This plan prevailed, and they encamped near Thayer, no fewer than 40,000 strong. The Roman camp was at a distance of 12 stades. There was constant skirmishing at first, then the two armies met face to face. The battle swayed now this way, now that, with many casualties on both sides. Athenian, who had a fighting force of 200 horse, was victorious and covered the whole area about him with corpses, but after being wounded in both knees and receiving a third blow as well, he was of no service in fighting, whereupon the runagate slaves lost spirit and were routed. Athenian was taken for dead and so was not detected. By thus feigning death, he made good his escape during the coming night. The Romans won a brilliant victory, for Tryphon's army and Tryphon himself turned and fled. Many were cut down in flight, and no fewer than 20,000 were finally slain. Under cover of night, the rest escaped to Triacala, though it would have been an easy matter to dispatch them also, if only the praetor had followed in pursuit. The slave party was now so dejected that they even considered returning to their masters and placing themselves in their hand. But it was the sentiment of those who had pledged themselves to fight to the end and not to yield themselves abjectly to the enemy that at last prevailed. On the 9th day following, the praetor arrived to lay siege to Triacala. After inflicting and suffering some casualties, he retired worsted, and the rebels once more held their heads high. The praetor, whether through indolence or because he had been bribed, accomplished nothing of what needed doing, and in consequence he was later haled to judgment by the Romans and punished. 9. Gaius Servilius, sent out as praetor to succeed Lucullus, likewise achieved nothing worthy of note. Hence he, like Lucullus, was later condemned and sent into exile. On the death of Tryphon, Athenian succeeded to the command, and, since Servilius did nothing to hinder him, he laid cities under siege, overran the country with impunity, and brought many places under his sway. The praetor Lucullus, on learning that Gaius Servilius, the praetor appointed to succeed him in the war, had crossed the strait, disbanded his army, and set fire to the camp and the constructions, for he did not wish his successor in the command to have any significant resources for waging war. Since he himself was being denounced for his supposed desire to enlarge the scope of the war, he assumed that by ensuring the humiliation and disgrace of his successor, he was also dispelling the charge brought against himself. 10. At the end of the year, Gaius Marius was elected consul at Rome for the 5th time, with Gaius Aquilius one as his colleague. It was Aquilius who was sent against the rebels, and by his personal valor won a resounding victory over them. Meeting Athenian, the king of the rebels, face to face, he put up an heroic struggle. He slew Athenian and was himself wounded in the head, but recovered after treatment. Then he continued the campaign against the surviving rebels, who now numbered 10,000. When they did not abide his approach, but sought refuge in their strongholds, Aquilius unrelentingly employed every means till he had captured their forts and mastered them. But 1,000 were still left, with Satyrus at their head. Aquilius at first intended to subdue them by force of arms, but when later, after an exchange of envoys, they surrendered, he released them from immediate punishment and took them to Rome to do combat with wild beasts. There, as some report, they brought their lives to a most glorious end, for they avoided combat with the beasts and cut one another down at the public altars, Satyrus himself slaying the last man. Then he, as the final survivor, died heroically by his own hand. Such was the dramatic conclusion of the Sicilian slave war, a war that lasted about 4 years. 12. Saturninus the tribune, one who was a man of licentious pursuits, had as quaestor been charged with the transport of grain from Ostia to Rome, but since his idle and frivolous behavior encouraged the judgment that he had not been a success as director of the operation, he was duly rebuked. The Senate, in fact, stripped him of his authority and transferred his charge to others. But once he had corrected his former loose habits and adopted a sober manner of life, he was raised by the people to the tribunate. 13. A certain man named Batises, a priest of the great mother of the gods, arrived, says Diodorus, from Picenus in Phrygia. Claiming that he had come by command of the goddess, he obtained an audience with the consuls and with the Senate, in which he stated that the temple of the goddess had been defiled and that rites of purification to her must be performed at Rome in the name of the state. The robe he wore, like the rest of his costume, was outlandish and by Roman standards not to be countenanced, for he had on an immense golden crown and a gaudy cape shot with gold, the marks of royal rank. After addressing the populace from the rostra and creating in the crowd a mood of religious awe, he was granted lodging and hospitality at the expense of the state, but was forbidden by one of the tribunes, Aulus Pompeius, to wear his crown. Brought back to the rostra by another of the tribunes and questioned as to what ritual purity for the temple required, he couched his answers in words evocative of holy dread. When he was thereupon attacked in a partisan spirit by Pompeius and was contemptuously sent back to his lodgings, he refused to appear again in public, saying that not only he, but the goddess as well, had been impiously treated with disrespect. Pompeius was straightway smitten with a raging fever, then lost his voice and was stricken with quinsy, and on the third day died. To the man in the street, it seemed that his death was an act of divine providence and requital for his offences against the goddess and her priest, for the Romans are very prone to fear in matters of religion. Accordingly, Batises was granted a special dispensation in regard to his costume, and the sacred robe was honoured with notable gifts, and when he started homeward from Rome was escorted on his way by a large crowd, both men and women. 14. The Roman soldiers had a custom that when a general of theirs who with them joined battle against an enemy had slain 6,000 of the foe, they hailed and acclaimed him imperator, that is to say, king. 15. Envoys of King Mithridates arrived in Rome, bringing with them a large sum of money with which to bribe the Senate. Saturninus, thinking that this gave him a point of attack on the Senate, behaved with great insolence towards the embassy. At the instigation of the senators, who promised to lend their support, the outraged envoys preferred charges against Saturninus for his insulting treatment. The trial, held in public, was of great import because of the inviolability attaching to ambassadors and the Romans' habitual detestation of any wrongdoing where embassies were concerned. It was therefore a capital charge of which Saturninus stood accused, and since his prosecutors were men of senatorial rank, and it was the Senate to judge such cases, he was thrown into great fear and great danger. Alarmed by the serious nature of the issues at stake, he had recourse to pity, the common refuge of the unfortunate. Laying aside his costly attire, he donned instead a shabby garb, and letting his hair and beard grow, canvassed the urban proletariat. Falling at the knees of some and grasping others by the hands, he begged and besought them with tears to aid him in his distress. He told them that he was being made a victim of the Senate's partisanship in violation of all justice, and pointed out that it was because of his concern for the common people that he was being treated in this way, and that, moreover, his enemies were at one and the same time his accusers and his judges. The populace, aroused to a man by his prayers, massed many thousands strong at the place of judgment, and he was unexpectedly acquitted. Having the support of the people, he was again proclaimed tribune. 16. For 2 years the exile of Metellus I was discussed in the public assembly. His son, letting his hair and beard grow and wearing a shabby garb, went about the forum beseeching the citizens, and falling at their knees in tears, begged them one by one to grant his father's return. The people, though unwilling to give the exiles a foothold that would enable them to return in violation of the laws, nevertheless, through pity for the young man and because of his zeal in his father's cause, recalled Metellus and gave the son, in tribute to his devotion to the cause of his sire, the cognomen Pius.